Whenever we hear that a country has trillions of dollars of national debt, the immediate reaction is almost always total panic. I mean, we see those massive numbers flashing across our screens, the headlines describing debt as this ticking time bomb, the constant arguing on the news. It's incredibly easy to feel anxious about it. And honestly, I completely get it. But today, we are going to take a calm, clear-eyed journey into genuine understanding. By the end of this explainer, you're going to be able to see right past those scary headlines and understand exactly how modern economies actually work.
Think of me as your finance teacher, and here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover what national debt actually is, how governments borrow, who they borrow from, the all-important debt-to-GDP ratio, when debt actually gets dangerous, and finally, why this matters to you. Let's dive right in.
All right, Section 1. What is national debt? Building the foundation. To really grasp the big picture, we've got to master the basic vocabulary first. Let's start with a word you hear all the time on the news: deficit. A deficit is simply what happens when a government spends more money than it brings in through taxes and other revenue. But here is the crucial part. This is only measured within one specific single year. It's just a temporary one-year shortfall. It is not the grand total. Now compare that to debt. National debt is the grand total of all those single-year shortfalls just stacked right on top of each other. It is the massive, historical accumulation of all past borrowing combined. The media constantly mixes these two up, but they are completely different concepts. Think of it like a leaky faucet dripping into a bucket. The deficit is the amount of water pouring into the bucket this particular year. The debt is all the water that's currently sitting in the bucket from years and years past. Let's put a simple number on it so the math really clicks. If a government spends $100 billion more than it collects this year, well, it has a $100 billion deficit. And then that exact $100 billion gets added directly to the existing national debt. It's literally just simple addition. Okay, moving to Section 2. How governments actually borrow. The mechanics of the market. So you might be wondering, why don't governments just spend exactly what they collect in taxes and call it a day? It's a super fair question. But think about a family taking out a mortgage to buy a home. They take on a big chunk of debt to acquire really valuable long-term asset. Governments do something very similar. They borrow to fund massive long-term investments like roads, bridges, hospitals, and scientific research. Because these projects benefit future generations for decades to come, governments spread the cost out over time, rather than just dropping an impossibly huge tax bill on citizens all at once. Plus, borrowing is an absolute lifesaver for emergencies like natural disasters or pandemics. It lets a government respond instantly without slamming struggling citizens with sudden, crushing taxes. So how do they actually do this borrowing? They use something called a bond. Think of a government bond as just a really formal IOU. Here's how it works. First, the government issues a bond, let's say for $1,000. Second, an investor buys that bond, handing their $1,000 over to the government. Third, as a thank you, the government pays that investor regular interest over time. And finally, when the bond expires, or matures, as they say in finance, the government returns the original $1,000. Boom! That is the entire life cycle of government borrowing, completely demystified. Which brings us to Section 3. Who owns the debt? The surprising lenders. Now, this is where things get really fascinating. When you hear about trillions in debt, who exactly do you picture lending out all that cash? A lot of people imagine some shadowy, mysterious global bank. But the reality is a massive paradigm shift for most folks. The debt isn't just owed to outsiders. It's largely owed to ordinary people and everyday organizations. We're talking everyday citizens, your local pension funds, insurance companies, and regular banks. Think about it. If your retirement fund owns government bonds, then a tiny piece of the national debt is actually owed directly to you, the future retiree. Investors love buying these bonds because governments have strong taxation powers, making them incredibly safe, stable places to park their money. Let's look at Section 4, the debt-to-GDP ratio. Context is everything. Now, hearing that a country owes $1 trillion sounds absolutely terrifying in isolation, doesn't it? But here's the thing about economics. An isolated number is totally useless without context. We have to introduce what is arguably the most crucial metric in all of economics, GDP, or gross domestic product. Technically, it's the total value of all goods and services produced in a country. But to keep it simple, just think of a country's GDP as its total annual income. Let's break this down using everyday personal finance. Imagine two people who both just took out a $100,000 loan. Is that a dangerous amount of debt? Well, it entirely depends, right? For a person earning $500,000 a year, a $100,000 loan is totally manageable, no sweat.
But for a person earning only $25,000 a year, that exact same debt is completely crushing. Income matters. A country with a massive GDP can easily handle a massive debt. It's the ratio between the two that tells the real, true story of a country's financial health.
Moving to Section 5. When does debt become dangerous? The real limits.
Now, you might be sitting there feeling a bit skeptical, thinking, wait a minute, is this person saying debt doesn't matter at all? Not at all. While debt is a highly effective tool, it absolutely has very real, very dangerous limits. Let's walk through the warning signs of a true debt crisis. The first big red flag is high interest payments. If a government spends way too much of its budget just paying up interest, there's suddenly way less money for vital public services. The second is rising interest rates, which suddenly makes all new borrowing painfully expensive. But the ultimate, absolute danger is the third one, loss of investor confidence. If lenders start actually fearing they won't get paid back, they stop lending, period. And that is when a country hits true, severe financial instability.
Which naturally leads to the single most common anxiety-driven question beginners ask. Can a country actually go bankrupt? Well, the short answer is yes. Sovereign defaults absolutely do happen in history. But remember, governments aren't like regular households or businesses. Governments possess unique taxation authority and massive economic influence, especially if they are borrowing in their very own currency. They kind of operate under a totally different set of financial physics, giving them far, far more flexibility than you or I have.
Okay, so if they control their own currency, here is the next logical question. If a government is drowning in debt, why don't they just, fire up the printers and print more money to pay it all off? Well, they can't because of one fundamental law of economics. Too much money chasing the same amount of goods equals severe inflation. If a government just prints trillions of dollars out of thin air to wipe out its debt, it dramatically reduces the value of every single dollar that's already out there in the world. Suddenly, the money in your pocket becomes virtually worthless, and prices for everyday things like groceries and housing just absolutely skyrocket. That's exactly why governments have to rely on careful borrowing and taxation instead of just relying on the money printers. Finally, Section 6, Why National Debt Matters, Your Everyday Life.
So we've covered some massive macroeconomic concepts today, but let's do a quick reset and clear out those old myths from your mental hard drive. Number 1, debt does not mean automatic economic collapse. Number 2, deficits and debt are not the same thing. Number 3, governments cannot just borrow forever without any consequences. And number 4, not all debt is harmful. When it's used to build lasting infrastructure, it's actually an incredible engine for growth. Honestly, you are now officially far more financially literate than the average person skimming the daily news. But here is exactly why you should care about all of this. Government debt decisions shape the very environment you live in every single day. It directly affects your tax rates. It influences the interest rates you're going to pay on your own mortgage or your car loan. It dictates whether the public roads you drive on are full of potholes, and it determines the funding for the social programs your local community relies upon. It is quite literally woven into the fabric of your daily life. It all ultimately boils down to this. The problem is rarely the debt itself. The problem is losing confidence in the government's ability to manage it. National debt is not some inherent doomsday device. It is a powerful, totally necessary tool of modern economies. What truly matters is how wisely that borrowed money is being used, and whether the overall load remains sustainable compared to the country's economic output. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If we understand now that national debt at its absolute best is just a way to finance long-term growth and stability, ask yourself, what kind of future is your country investing in today? Are they borrowing to build something lasting, or are they borrowing just to scrape by? Keep that question in the back of your mind the next time you see a flashing alarmist headline about the national debt, because you now have the solid foundational knowledge to see the full, real picture.